Welcome to part 16 in this series of videos where we create a birthday reminders application using Blazor and C#. In this video, we show how to deploy our new application to Azure. The birthday reminder application is designed to be used by multiple users, potentially spread over a wide geographic area. By signing up for the 12-month Azure free trial, costs should be kept to a minimum. After the 12-month free trial, there will be costs. From what I can see at the moment, the only future cost for just this application is the SQL database, which I hope and think will be around £5 per month. In this video, we've got a number of tasks to complete. Basically, there are two. We need to migrate the SQL database to Azure, and we need to publish the Birthdays app to Azure. Along the way, we'll be creating an Azure resource group and the SQL Server in Azure. We'll be using Visual Studio to publish the Birthdays app, and once published, we'll need to modify Azure B2C settings to include the web address of our new Birthdays app. And lastly, for reasons that I'll explain later, we need to use the Windows Task Scheduler to create a scheduled task. We're therefore going to be jumping around from Azure to Visual Studio to SQL Management Studio and Windows Task Scheduler. Hopefully this video won't be too disjointed. All the individual tasks are relatively straightforward. So let's start by having a look at Azure and creating a resource group. I have now logged into the Azure portal. But before we start migrating the SQL database to Azure, I thought it would be worth mentioning a situation that initially caught me out. When we originally set up the Azure B2C service, a separate directory was created, and you need to make sure you're in the correct directory to add the SQL Server and database. You can check you're in the right directory by clicking on this icon up here. And you'll see here that we've got two, a default directory and the one that was created when we created the Azure B2C service. We need to be in the default directory, which I happen to be. I'll now click Home. We have already created a resource group when setting up the Azure B2C service. However, I suggest creating a new resource group for the SQL database and the app. If anything goes wrong, it will then enable us to delete the new resource group while leaving the Azure B2C resource group intact. If we click Resource Groups and click Create, the subscription will default to your normal subscription, which might well be free, and we need to give it a name. And I'm going to call this Birthday App RG for resource group, and I'm going to have it in the Europe, UK South, since I'm based in the UK. So click Review and Create, and then Create. That's been created. The next thing we need to do is to create the SQL Server. So click the Home button. And don't be misled by the number of items up here that have SQL in front of them. So we've got SQL servers, we've got SQL databases, and if you select more services, there'll be other SQL named services as well. If you're at all stuck, if you enter SQL Server up here, you'll see SQL servers. I'd say this gives an example of some of the other things that are there that we don't want. SQL servers. And we want to create a new SQL server. Again, it'll default to the subscription, and we want to make sure that we select the correct resource group, the one that we've just added. We need to give it a name, and this has to be in lowercase. So I am going to call it Blazor Birthdays Server. And again, the location I'm going to choose is Europe, UK South. We're going to use SQL authentication, and we have to enter an admin login and password. I'm going to do this off screen and then return. Right, so I've entered a server admin login and password. Now click Review and Create. It says no additional charges up here, so that's good. And then click Create. This is likely to take quite a little while. From experience, it's somewhere around 5 minutes. So I'll stop the video and return when it's complete. The deployment of the SQL Server is complete. It didn't take quite as long as I was expecting on that occasion. So now we go to Resource. And there are a couple of things we need to do here. First of all, on firewalls and virtual network, we need to click Show Firewall Settings. And here we need to do two things. We need to allow Azure services and resources to access this service. And we need to click Add Client IP. This will allow us to connect to the Azure SQL database from our desktop or laptop. When that's been done, click Save. And we've now got the message to say success, so I'll just click that OK on that. We now have to jump across to SQL Management Studio because we're going to be carrying out the migration from SQL Management Studio. So I've got it already opened, and we want to choose our database, which is birthdays. Right click on that, select Tasks, and select Deploy Database to Microsoft Azure SQL Database. A wizard opens, and we just follow through this wizard. So click Next, and we have to connect to the server. Click Connect, and we want to enter in here the name of the server that we created in SQL. If in doubt, go back to the Azure portal and select Home and SQL Servers. It's actually Blazor Birthdays server. And we can get the name from here. So I'll just copy that, go back into SQL Management Studios and paste that in here. I also need to enter the login and password that I created, and let me enter those now. And I'm going to click Remember Password. Now click Connect. We're going to leave the name of the database the same, so it's going to be in birthdays in both our local development machine and in Azure. But this is the important bit. You must change the Azure SQL database settings. So click from Basic, and we want to select Standard. And it has to be 250 and SO. That is the free SQL database. If you select anything other than that, you may get charged. Then click Next, and it'll give a summary of what's going to happen. Click Finish. This will probably take a few minutes to complete, so I'll pause the video and come back once it's completed. Once the deployment is complete, and that did in fact take a few minutes, click the Close button. Before we publish the application, there are a few changes we need to make to the C# code to take account of the location of the Azure database. So if we go back to Visual Studio and open App Settings, we need to change our default connection string to point to the Azure database. But before we do that, I want to copy this line and save it so that we've still got a record of the local connection string. I'm going to paste it below, and I'm going to call it default local. We now need to change this default connection string to the Azure SQL database. So if we go back to Azure, and this is our birthday server, we should now see down here the name of the database. So if I click that, it'll bring up some information about the database, and it'll here in the top right hand quarter, it'll say show database connection strings. Select that, and we want to copy that to the clipboard. And you'll see in here it says server equals TCP, and then the name of the server and the name of the database. But the password has got in curly brackets your password, and we'll need to change that. So having copied that, we go back to we go back to Visual Studio, and we replace this line with the connection string from Azure, and we'll need now to change the password. I'm going to do that off screen, but at the same time I'd also point out that I'm using app-settings.json here. That's going to be used in production. For development purposes, it uses app-settings.development.json, and that's where I've got the correct code in here for things like the Azure AD, the tenant ID, the client ID, and I've also got the correct Syncfusion license and SMTP information. So again, off screen, I'm going to be copying those from the development into app-settings.json. You may not have that problem, but if you have been using app-settings.development, then you might need to change that as well. So let me do that. I've made those changes, but there was one thing that might be worth mentioning, and that is that in the connection string that we've copied from Azure, it had your password in curly brackets. You need to replace the whole of that, including the curly brackets, with your password. If I save everything now and run it, it should run, but will now be connected to the Azure SQL database. Right, the application started, and I'm now going to sign in. And I've successfully signed in. You'll notice here that it says HTTPS localhost 7142. That shows that I'm running it locally in development, but I should be connected to the Azure SQL database. And one way to test that is just to edit one of these records. If I select the top one and select edit, and I change John to say Johnny and save it, the SQL database should now have Johnny, whereas the local one should have John. Let me close this. So locally, under birthdays, tables, person, if I select to edit the top 200 rows, we'll see that that first person is called John, not Johnny. We should be able to connect to the Azure database from SQL Management Studio as well. So if I select Connect and choose Database Engine, and I enter the name of the server that we created in Azure with the login and password, I've got that tick to remember password, click Connect, and we're now connected to the Azure server. And if we look under databases and birthdays and tables, if we look at person and edit the top 200, we should see in there that we've now got Johnny, not John. So the SQL database has been successfully migrated to Azure. we can run the application and it connects correctly. All the background work has now been completed, so we can now publish the application. And we do that from Visual Studio. So let me go back to Visual Studio. In here, I'm going to save all files and close them all. And to publish, we right-click on the name of the project, not the name of the solution, and select Publish. And we get a wizard again. So we select Azure as the target and click Next. We select the top item as your App Service Windows as the specific target. And we're going to leave the subscription as our default description. Leave that as resource group. Don't do search, but click this plus sign up here to create a new Azure App Service. The first thing it'll give us is the name, and it'll use the name of our project and it'll add on to it the date and time. Get rid of that. And it's also worth noting that this is the name that will prefix our Azure websites.net when we've got the published web app. So it's worth making that as short and concise as you can. So we select Azure subscription. We select our birthdays app resource group. And under hosting plan, we click new. And we've got to make sure that down here we select free. And under the UK, I've selected location UK South. Click OK. And then click Create. That is now finished. So either I can click Next or Finish. If I click Next, it's going to give us a choice of how we want to save our published file. The XML is fine, so click Finish on there. I think it would have done that as a default anyway. And it gives us this screen. We don't need to select any of these items down here, and we can just click Publish. The first time you run it, the first time you publish and then run it, you'll come up with an error that could look similar to this. And it'll say localhost refused to connect, and we'll have HTTPS and then the localhost up here, sign in -OIDC. And the reason for this is that we haven't configured the Azure B2C service to allow access to our new web app. So we need to change that. So I'm going to close this. And that's probably stopped already. If we now go back to Azure, we need to change directory to the one where we added our Azure B2C service. So I'll click Directories and I'll switch to Blazor Code UK, which is where the Azure B2C service was. We now click the menu button up here and select Azure Active Directory. When that pops up, we then select App Registrations. And here is our Birthday Reminders app. We open that, and you'll see here we've got Redirect URIs. Click on that, and this will show the local host's URIs that we've already given ourselves access to. But we need to give ourselves access to our web app. So to do that, we need to create an additional URI here for our web app. The easiest way to do that is to go back to Visual Studio, and it'll give us the site address here. So I can copy that to the clipboard, swap back to Azure, click Add URI, paste it in here, but we do need to add on to the end of that, sign in -OIDC and save. I think that's saved. So we can now go back to our application again, and I'm going to select Open Site. We don't need to republish it. And it looks as if this is more promising. I can sign in. And we're now logged in at our Azure web app. But there's a problem. Immediately I can see that the next birthday is in US date format. I'm here in the UK and I'd like it in UK format, which is day, month, year. There is one other problem. If I click on the Hangfire dashboard, I can't reach it. So let's tackle those two problems. The first problem I'm going to tackle is the date aspect. So I'm going to go back to our Visual Studio and I'm going to close this. I discovered that I can get the date format correct by adding a couple of lines of code into program.cs. So I'll go to program.cs and I'll go to the location. We need to add in a builder service in here, one line in here, which I'll now add. I'm going to paste this in, and it's this line, builder services.add localization. And further down under our app use routing or routing, we need this line. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure whether we need both of these lines or whether just add localization would do it, but adding both certainly works. So that should give us the correct date format, and I suppose we ought to just test that. So to do that, we'll need to republish. So I can right click on here, click publish, and all I need to do now is click publish, and it will republish it for us. And now we can log in and we've got the dates in the correct format. I still can't get to the Hangfire dashboard. And to cut a long story short, I'm not going to pursue that. What I discovered was that the reason we can't access that is there's some security within Hangfire that only allows it to be accessed locally. And the reason I'm not going to pursue it is that if we start the application locally, i.e. not actually open the site, but open it in development mode, we'll find that we have access to it. So I've opened the application again, and you'll see we're now at HTTPS localhost, but I can access the Hangfire dashboard. So, as I say, I'm not too worried about the fact that I can't do it from the live site. I've always got access to it, and since it's only me that's going to have access to it, I'm not going to pursue that one. However, there was a much more serious problem that has required a less than ideal workaround. During most of my testing, the automatic reminders worked fine, but it turned out that this was because I was actively testing, constantly logging in and out of the web app. However, if I hadn't logged into the app for, say, an hour before the automatic email reminders were due to be sent, nothing happened. The cause of this behavior turned out that the web app service goes to sleep if it's not being accessed. This is a way of Azure minimizing resources. There is an option within Azure to keep the web app always on, but this is not available on the free service I'm using. To view this service, we log into the Azure portal, and I'm going to make sure that I'm in the correct directory, and I think we need to be in the default directory. Then if we select App Services, and we see our app service here, birthday reminders. If we click on Configuration, and look at the general settings, if we scroll down, you'll see that there's an option here that says Always On, but it's grayed out. We can't access it. And there's a little symbol there that says click here to upgrade to a higher SKU and enable additional features. Well, that's going to cost money, so I don't want to do that. I was a little bit surprised at this point. It threatened to wreck all the work I had put into the project, so I had to come up with a workaround. I don't guarantee this workaround will always work. All I will claim at the moment is that it appears to work. Since the automatic email reminders worked either whilst I was logged in or had been recently logged in, I reasoned that if I could kick the application into life, the reminders would be sent, and drew on my experience with my original Microsoft Access application for inspiration. My original Microsoft Access application was installed on my desktop PC, which I leave on more or less permanently, and even if it had been switched off, I could almost be sure it would be switched on around lunchtime. I could also more or less rely on the fact that I wouldn't be using the PC around 13:30 most days. I therefore used a Windows scheduled task to start the Microsoft Access application every day at 13:30. It would search for forthcoming birthdays and send an email if any were found. My workaround is therefore to create a Windows scheduled task on my desktop PC to open a browser and go to the birthdays web app at a particular time every day. Time to open the web app a few minutes before the hangfire recurring job is scheduled to start. So if we start by looking at Visual Studio and look at Program CS, let's go there. We'll see that the service is timed to run at 35 minutes past 1600 hours, and that I'm using time zone info local. I'm going to change that from the middle of the afternoon. In my Access application, I used 13:30. I'm going to time this to go off in the middle of the night. So I'm going to choose 35 minutes past 03. And I'm also going to change it from time zone info to local to timefo info UTC. And the reason I'm choosing that is that in the UK, where I'm located, we have daylight savings in summer, and I could see that if I had that, I'd have to come and change either this or the Windows scheduled task whenever we had daylight saving coming in or going out, i.e. either in October or March. And I don't trust my memory to make those changes. So I'm changing everything to UTC. It'll mean that the email reminders might go off at 3:30 in the winter and 4:30 in the summer or something like that, but it doesn't really matter. I notice this is running, so I'm just going to stop it. So that's the first change. So let's have a look at the Windows scheduled task. And to do this, the easiest way is to search for it. And we're going to create a new scheduled task. So click Create, and we give it a name. Anything will do. Blazor birthdays seems like a nice one. You might need to play around with these settings down here. I've got this set to run only when user is logged in. I don't want to complicate things at the moment, so I'll leave that as is. So the next thing we need to do is click the Triggers tab, and we need to create a new trigger. And I want it to go off daily, and I want it to start at 03:30. And that'll be that'll be 5 minutes before the email reminders are timed. And I want it to recur every day. I'll leave all these as the defaults and click OK. Oh, one last thing. I'm going to tick Synchronize across time zones. I think that will fix this at UTC. Unfortunately, I won't be able to find out until October, but I think that's how it works. So I'll click OK on that. And we want an action. Now for action, we want to start something like Microsoft Edge or Google Chrome. So I'll browse for the program, and Microsoft Edge is the one I'm going to choose. It happens to be in C Program Files x86 Microsoft Edge application. Click OK on that, and we want to put an argument here, and that's going to be the web address of our application. So back in C#, under the publishing page, I can copy that from here and paste it in here. Or I could have typed it in. Click OK. Conditions and settings don't require any changes there, as far as I'm aware. So we can leave those as they are and then click OK. With that in place, the Windows scheduled task should start every day and attempt to open our website. I've also discovered that it doesn't seem to matter that it only gets as far as the login page. That seems to be sufficient to start the web app. The other thing to add is that I'm doing this on my desktop PC, which never goes to sleep. I have had some lack of success when I've used it on my laptop, which is set to go to sleep after 15 minutes. So make sure that you're using a PC that doesn't go to sleep. I do, of course, turn the screen off, but that's a different matter. So with that, I think that our application is deployed. It's deployed correctly. We've migrated the SQL database, and we should have our automatic reminders sent at 3:30 or 3:35 every morning. I think that brings us to the end of this particular video. I hope it might also be the end of this series. If I discover any other little quirks or digressions that need to be covered, I will issue a new updated video, but I think that should be it for this video. If you've watched the video so far, thank you very much indeed. I'm very grateful. I hope it has enabled you to learn something. I've certainly learned more than I intended. If I find any information that relates to this video, I'll put it in the description below, such as links to the code. So thank you very much for watching, and watch out for new videos. I'm not quite sure what's coming up, but probably something. We'll have one last look at the application.